You look like you have too much sun in your face, Brandan. I'm jealous of the amount of daylight you have.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
I only use my phone, actual phone, for audio now. It's so stupid.
Nice.
Everything breaking all the time. It's just so annoying.
It's in line with the rest of the project. I don't see anything wrong.
Hey, people.
Hey, Michelle.
We're just waiting for one more person for quorum.
We can do it this time. I can feel it. I think we are at 7 now. Brian Grant just joined.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just checking on Phil and Sarah. I think Sarah can't make it, but I'll check on Phil.
Give us one more minute and start.
Yeah.
Michelle, I kind of gathered you had maybe already swept through things this morning, so you might have the best state of mind to be posting today if that's cool with you. Otherwise, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, I can do it.
All right. Michelle's our bosun.
Let me just pull up the agenda real quick. I just X'd out and the project board.
I can take notes.
Okay, cool.
Down one entry, Brandan.
Oh.
So yeah, feel free to add whatever to the board or to the agenda, and let's start. Hi everyone, today is September 26th, 2018. You're at the steering committee meeting. We are going to go through the project board as our first agenda item. So I will share my screen. Well, okay. Can everybody see stuff? Okay, so let's see. Let's start in the blocked column. I asked Jaice if there was anything that we needed to do here, but it seems like SIG Docs is taking over here. Does anybody else have anything to add? Aaron, you're tilting your head. Okay.
No, I didn't know SIGDocs was doing anything there. It seems I was going to propose we get this out of our blocked category because I don't think we're actively doing anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I think where we may need to support SIG docs and SIG testing and SIG release is if they impose requirements on things, changes going into releases. I think we should back them up.
Okay. All right, I'll follow up with Jaice as just an agenda item to figure out if they need anything. I actually already reached out to him, so I'm just waiting for him to contact me back. Can someone throw that on the notes so I remember to do that? Okay, steering committee elections.
Sorry, just before we go into that, Brian, what backup did you have in mind there? What assistance they need?
So in the past, when anybody tries to impose some new process or rule or gate on other contributors in the project, there is a range of responses from pushback to ignoring it and doing their own thing anyway. And we would just need to make sure that if either of one of those things happen, that we really back up that they have the authority to establish whatever policy is necessary to ensure that features being added to Kubernetes have high quality documentation, for example.
Okay. I was kind of hoping that they would do that themselves and escalate to us if they need our assistance.
I think we should make it clear, make sure that they understand that's what we expect.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Maybe that's the action item, is just to tell them that they should not hesitate to escalate if they have any problems.
Yeah, some people feel more empowered than other people. And this is definitely something we've expressed that we want to do, is to delegate to the groups that we believe should have the authority because they have the domain knowledge.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not sure. We could either wait and see, or we can explicitly tell them that in advance that they are empowered and we expect them to escalate if they need help.
I guess what would help from my perspective is to get links to the SIG docs issues that are subsuming the documentation requirements issue, and I'm happy to go chat with them if need be.
Typically, though, the problem is awareness that they have these powers. Like, you have to say it like 30 times in a community forum in order for it to kind of even get registered. I don't have a good answer for this, of how you disseminate information so that it becomes clear about what rights and rules and responsibilities people have. It seems like you just have to regurgitate it over and over again.
Yeah, there is no single best way that things can be communicated a single time. And you're right. We just need to repeat it in multiple different forums, Kubernetes dev, community meetings, probably other places.
But I think it's up to the SIGs to do that communication and say, here's our charter, this is what we're doing. We have been granted authority to manage this part of the process. And if someone kicks up a fuss and says, how on earth can you have that authority, then it gets escalated. I don't think it's our job to do that.
I agree. I agree that should be the case, but the only there haven't been very many horizontals where that has been established in the past. Like the release team, I think people understand has certain powers, but for example, with the features process, some people felt entitled to bypass that, or to quibble with the criteria for what should be a feature and what should not be a feature. Or similarly for testing, when owners were assigned, people didn't feel like it was their responsibility to make the test pass. So I think, that's what we want to be the case. I don't think it's the case yet.
Okay.
So I was just, not to beat the dead horse, but I feel like we have said this repeatedly. I think one way of doing this more organically is to make sure there are steering committee members who are active participants in all SIGs That's the codify steering committee liaisons for SIGs into SIGs YAML task in the in progress column, which I have still made zero progress on whatsoever. It kind of seemed like that's something that should wait until after the steering committee elections have concluded and the steering committee for next year has been announced. I think during the announcement of those results would be a good time to remind everybody just briefly that we expect you to come to us, not for us to come to you, and probably a good reminder for those SIGs that haven't filled out charters to fill their charters out. Because that was something where I had asked previously if we wanted to ensure that all SIGs had their charters by the time this next election cycle rolled around, so we could at least have gotten the steering committee has granted SIGs authority over what they say they have authority over, and we're still incomplete there. So I think addressing those meta points, it probably addresses Quinton's concerns. I was just trying to drive us on a documentation requirements issue. If it sounds like SIGDocs is taking this over, if there's a specific thing they're doing that we need to help them with, or if it's we can close because SIGDocs is taking care of it.
Yeah, maybe we should ask Jaice to refile that somewhere with SIGDocs.
Okay. I am already having a conversation with him, so I can ask about that. And then communicate what we've talked about how they have ownership and authority, and make sure they know. Unless you have that action item, Aaron.
No, please go for it.
Okay. Do we feel like we've come to a sufficient consensus on the documentation requirements agenda item or issue?
Yep.
Okay. Steering committee elections are in progress. The last day to vote is October 3rd. So there is nothing that I saw that was a red flag or anything. Quinton or anyone else, do you have an update on the election stuff? Would you like to say anything about it?
No, I've actually been out for the last 2 weeks, so I don't know the current status. I'm not aware of any problems. I believe it was successfully announced and is going ahead. If anyone has any different information, please feel free to share.
Okay, great.
One slight meta thing I was going to raise is that the Meet Our Contributors Steering Committee edition is Wednesday, October 3rd. I wasn't sure if it made sense to talk to Paris about maybe swapping that to the next week so that people could get to meet the new steering committee.
Oh, that's such a good idea, yeah.
And there's going to be one the
All right.
following.
I will take it. Right, I'll take an action item to talk to her about that because I think she has it scheduled at the first Wednesday of the month instead of the third Wednesday of the month. And maybe this month it makes sense to swap those.
Okay. Any objections?
Not an objection, just moving meetings around like this causes disruption. I'm wondering if it's worth it or if people can just wait 2 weeks to meet the new committee.
Well, that's...
And third? I didn't realize it was two.
So this is Meet Our Contributors, right? The idea is Meet Our Contributors is done off cycle from steering committee meetings, and the steering committee is intended to be regularly invited to one per month.
Mm-hmm.
Meet Our Contributors already happens twice a month.
Okay, gotcha. And so I saw like the next one after October 3rd is like November 7th or something. So,
okay, that makes sense. Okay, ignore what I said. Makes sense.
Cool. So the other question I had for y'all, tactically speaking, is how you want to collect and disseminate election results. You probably want to make sure you exclude myself, Quinton, and Tim from that process.
I was under the impression that the election committee would take care of that process. Am I under the wrong impression, Quinton?
That was my impression too.
Yeah.
I don't know whether we wanted to, I think we had the right to veto candidates if we thought they were inappropriate, which I think has happened already if necessary. So I don't think there's much to do for us other than have the election committee announce the results.
It's the steering committee that announces the results.
Okay, didn't know that. Now I know that. Aaron, do you want to touch base with the elections committee to see if they have thoughts on that?
Sure.
Okay, and then
So the results are going to be in a CIBS report.
Yeah,
but-
it's like a Civs thing. I'm just, yeah, whether or not it makes sense for Quinton, Tim, and myself to see those results or not, because I think last year they were shared with steering private, which you only got to see if you got voted in.
Yeah. So we shouldn't see the whole list, I guess. I think we should see just the top 3 results. And yeah, maybe y'all shouldn't see them. And then we can discuss, if anybody has objections, we can raise them on a thread separately and go from there. Does that make sense?
Sure. I guess I'm just wondering what objections we can have to the outcome of a vote.
Yeah, unless there's a technical problem. Like one thing to check with George and Paris is whether we're getting the expected number of responses. Is that if we weren't, that could suggest some kind of technical problem, which has happened occasionally in the past. Hopefully we've learned from those lessons and it was done in a way that would avoid those problems. But I think that would be the thing to check. But yeah, if we get a reasonable number of responses, I would say the election results probably are not going to be very disputable.
Okay. We still have veto powers, so for candidates, just kidding. Okay, great. So so Quinton, do you want to check in with Paris to see if they're having any technical issues, and then let us know if there are some action items that come from that conversation?
Sure. I mean, maybe just to canvass this group, is the feeling here that we would like to preview the results, we possibly excluding the people standing for election, preview the results before the announcement? And do we want to do the announcement, or are we happy with delegating that to the election committee? I don't have terribly strong feelings either way. I'd be comfortable delegating all of it to the election committee, possibly with a 48-hour, notice to ourselves saying this is the outcome of the election. Unless there are any objections, we're going to announce it like this in 2 days' time. Is everyone comfortable with that? Or?
The steering committee announcing the results is what we agreed upon as we iterated upon these docs months ago. But your call. The idea was the Bootstrap committee were the people who announced it last year, since the Bootstrap committee were in charge of putting this whole process together. And the idea would be to have the continuing steering committee members announce the results for this year.
Yeah, like I say, I don't feel very strongly. I'm just trying to get us out of critical paths of as many things as possible. And this seems like one of those things we can get rid of. I'm happy to go with whatever the majority consensus is. If we've already decided it and everybody's happy with that, we can go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I would just say, yeah, I would be in favor of not re-litigating if we already, I do remember discussing it before, so
fine.
I would just stay with that.
Okay, so I will ask Paris to give us a heads up once the results are in, give us a summary of what they suggest that we announce, and then we just announce it. And they can even prepare the announcement, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Cool.
Yeah, that'd be great. So, okay. So you just said, and they can even announce it, but really
they can prepare the announcement.
You can prepare the announcement. Okay, thank you. So that's great. And then also, if there's any technical issues, you check on that, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Thank you. Are we all good? Any other points you want to discuss here?
I'm confused about the detailed election results. Was there an action item there or something, or is that just discussion?
I am checking in.
I highlighted it in the.
I'm checking in with Paris to ensure that however the election officers choose to share the detailed election results, they are shared with members of the steering committee, excluding the 3 of us who may not be reelected.
Okay. I'll leave that to you then.
Else? Okay. Moving forward to the document how working groups should be formed. So we have a poll request opened up that both Brandan and I had some comments on. Does anybody want to lead the discussion on this document or this item? Okay. So right now we have some blocking comments that just need to be addressed. Do we want to go ahead and have that discussion here?
I think it makes sense. Brandan's here, right? He was one of the main
Yeah, I'm here.
complainants.
Go ahead and share your perspective if you'd like.
I like that Quinton said complainers. So, I mean, I think my perspective is that I felt like the working groups as spec were basically too tightly aligned to SIGs and prevented the community from forming ad hoc groups that are nonetheless communities. I can see the concern that somehow the output of such a group would be assumed to be in some way endorsed by the Kubernetes project, and that we want to be careful about what is sort of an endorsed outcome. And so I can see the subtlety there, but I feel like there's a lot of examples of things that have been done in the past that I don't think could have become working groups. I think third-party resources is the primary one that I would cite, having sort of lived through the degree to which I had to fight for that and the skepticism that I was faced with. I don't think I could successfully create such a working group today. And that's probably not good for the project.
Well, I have a question about that example. And that example, why do you think it should be a working group? And it seems like a sub-project of a specific SIG. Like it doesn't cross SIG boundaries or anything like that. It is a...
Well, I think it actually would cross the SIG boundaries between architecture and API machinery, as well as honestly user experience, because ultimately the argument around the design, a lot of the argument around the design was about user experience and extensibility. I think more importantly, I guess that what I would like to see is a home for projects that people want to pursue and discuss that maybe don't have SIG endorsement. And I think that's going to be an important part of the project. I thought that was in some ways what working groups are for. If we don't say that, if we think that working groups are sort of aligned very tightly to SIGs, then we probably should have some other kind of grouping that is not.
My impression is that working groups should be the opposite. Like if it's actually just within the bounds of a single SIG, it should just be a sub-project of that SIG, right? Like SIG networking has ingress and it has DNS and it has several other things. And those are efforts, sub-efforts, so sub-projects that are just within SIG network. They shouldn't be working groups. We have many working groups today that shouldn't be working groups. They are just sub-projects or efforts within SIGs. So
that's fine. I don't really, it's not the one or many that is the issue. It is the fact that there's a lot of language in there about how it has to be effectively endorsed and the output has to be endorsed by a SIG and things like that, that I think are, they're unnecessary. First of all, I think it's unnecessary. And second of all, I think it is overly restrictive.
Well, we had the birds of a feather discussions in the past, and there was some feeling that we shouldn't endorse that kind of a group, but that sounds like the direction.
Well, I guess that a birds of a feather is different in the sense that, like, I think that you do want to have something that really, that is working towards something that is going to be part of Kubernetes.
Well, isn't that, right? So we had the repo discussion. Why isn't this an associated repo?
No, because it's different, right? An associated repo is birds of a feather. Like, I think birds of a feather is pretty well aligned with associated repo. And I think this is more like, how do you explore something new that may or may not be successful and may or may not be important in a way that the outcome could, if it turns out to be important and useful, could become part of Kubernetes.
So does such a thing have to start off as part of the Kubernetes project, or could it be a group of people independently doing their own thing, and when they feel like they have a proof of concept that makes the case, they bring it to the Kubernetes project to adopt this as part of a specific SIGs sub-project, or to be discussed further among SIGs as a working group?
I think the challenge is that it's very difficult to build consensus and attract interest if if it doesn't sort of have some degree of endorsement from the broader community, that there is a path, right? That there is a path into it being.
So my feeling is that associated repos were intended to solve this problem. Like working groups are not about owning code that is going to be owned by a single entity. It's about getting cross-cutting work done or developing a shared of.
But concretely, Brian, I mean, so concretely, how would you develop something like third-party resources? How would you develop something like third-party resources when all of the people who are interested in API machinery said, this is a terrible idea, you should never do it?
So third-party resource, I think, ended up getting implemented as CRD as a separate API server that was then aggregated in. So that could have totally been developed outside the project.
I don't know. It actually really, it wasn't developed as a third party. That's actually not true.
No, I'm talking about how it's implemented now.
Brandan, what I would say is that we're at the phase of the product where something like third-party resources happening in tree should not happen unless you can get the stakeholders involved agreed. Like I think.
Oh no, that's fine. I don't care about the entry. I don't care about the entry.
I think like we were a different project there then than we are now.
I don't care about the in-tree versus out-of-tree. What I care about is, do we really believe that the SIGs are vested with all of the power to determine what is and is not part of Kubernetes?
I mean, if it's a good idea, do it outside of the Kubernetes community proper and, make it happen.
So I've seen a couple of variants of this, right? Like, so SIG scheduling, there's a bunch of projects out there that are forking the scheduler and coming up with interesting ideas or creating new things. And when they come back to the SIG, there's a lot of, here's how we did this. We'd like to do this. Some of those are successful. Some of those are not. SIG scheduling is maybe not the best example because they're also the project with the most uncompleted items across the SIGs. But there at least is a model where they have a fairly active set of people bringing ideas in. Networking is a very interesting one because networking, there's like 1,000 flowers blooming there. And the fact that SIG networking doesn't endorse any of them hasn't even really been a problem. But on the core projects, I do think that Brendan's concern is, could you explore something that is controversial, but there is partial interest for in a way that feels like it's part of the, it feels like it's, we agree to disagree. I'm going to explore in a way that is a part of the project without, without being like, oh, we can't talk about that here because that's this other project. Like trying to create a space for those does feel something. And it doesn't feel like working groups to me. But on the other hand, like some of the more successful working groups were that this was a very controversial topic, like resource management was extremely controversial, and resource management brought all the stakeholders together, found consensus, talked through some very thorny issues, resolved very serious, disagreements among Googlers and non-Googlers and Intel folks and Red Hatters and CoreOS people. So I do think that working group has been used effectively to make contentious ideas possible that would not have been possible otherwise.
So yeah, and I think that's basically my goal and what I was saying. But I think Clayton summarizes it well.
But I mean, somebody building like a prototype or an example out of a working group is one thing, but I think there's a pretty stark difference between that and code that's actually going to live on, in perpetuity inside the project.
Yeah, and I don't see working groups as doing that, right? I mean, maybe that's a distinction, but maybe that's what we want to make a distinction between, like working group versus proposal group. I don't know, but like I agree that if you're landing tree code, that's different than if you're sort of trying to come up with a concrete position paper that people could vote yay or nay on effectively, right?
Right. So I'm not sure which you're arguing a working group is.
I would hope that working group covers both, actually. But if we want to separate it, I could see the argument for separating it.
I don't think there's enough structure in place for it. Doesn't make a lot of sense to have that kind of hierarchy or structure, because a lot of the working groups are formed via a need, and they're informal, and they're usually SIG stakeholders that are involved or participants in those working groups. So if they want to develop, take an idea and see it through to fruition, they're often involved back in the SIG to take a concept and drive it home towards adoption.
And I think that's fine, but I guess the question is like, do we really believe that gating on a SIG's approval is required for a working group? Because right now, that's what the doc says.
Yes,
I would say no.
And I would say no as well.
Yeah,
I would
so
say yes to be part of the Kubernetes project. You have to tie it to something.
Why?
So I think this is a question of what are working groups for? Like, I feel like a lot of this discussion we had when we did the repositories proposal, and we're trying to cut scope of the project and slow down evolution of the core and create well-defined extension points and things like that. So we went through the process of defining like what is in the core project, who decides that, what is in Kubernetes SIGs, who decides that, encouraging more things to grow as associated repos if they're new efforts. Working groups, I do view them as, creating proposals or driving consensus or working cross-SIG. They don't own the end resulting code. That is owned by the SIGs where that code lands, but the SIGs have to then buy into that code long term. So I'm not really sure what's being discussed here. It seems to cross a lot of those.
I guess concretely, having run into this somewhat repeatedly, I don't think that the SIG should be vested with the ability to shut down ideas and effectively force them out of the Kubernetes project.
I think I agree with that, Brandan, and I'm wondering whether the solution to this isn't advising SIGs on what their role is. I mean, this word endorsement and approval and whatever is a pretty fuzzy edge term.
Yes.
Does endorsing a working group mean that we think this is a great idea and we want them to like build the stuff into the core? Or does endorsing mean we think it's okay to go and explore this idea that may fail? Which I think
so concretely, if there's code that's being produced, sorry, Aaron.
I was going to say the same thing. Like, I'm positing my argument on the axiom that SIGs are the only entity in this project that can own code.
No, that's fine, but that's independent, right? Like,
but hang on, so working groups cannot. Ergo, if a working group wants to develop code that is part of this project, it must have buy-in from a SIG willing to own.
No, that's not true. You don't need buy-in. You need an owner to review and approve the code, just like you do it any other time you write code.
You need
that's totally orthogonal to a working group.
You need approval to merge that code. But
exactly. Like you need approval to merge the code, right?
Yeah,
and that's a working group. At least that's a SIG that.
And that's fine. Like I'm totally fine with SIG saying like we get to choose who merges code. That's fine. But that seems totally orthogonal to a working group.
Merging
and if a working group goes
are different.
Go ahead.
Merging code and creating code are different. Like
exactly.
I think everybody in this project, whether they're in a SIG, whether it's something cross-cutting, should feel very free to go create very interesting cross-cutting ideas. And associated repos is a good place for that stuff to land. But creating code and driving ideas to either like anything that crosses SIG boundaries almost certainly is going to be something that, what forum do you have it? Where do you have meetings? Where do you publish the findings? Do you report back to SIGs all the time? I do feel if we limit this down to, working groups can create code, but the code they create isn't implicitly part of Kubernetes until a SIG owner approves it.
Yeah.
And there's no implication that if a working group creates code that it should be expected to land. I think failure of a working group should be an expected outcome, and that's fine.
Yeah.
I just want to be explicit here. I think one of the scenarios that I'm personally afraid of is that somebody writes code, gets it merged, a SIG is then signed up to sort of own that code moving forward, but they never actually had any process of vetting it. And then users end up starting to take advantage of it and depend on it, right? So I think getting more formal around making sure that it's something that's in line with the folks who are sort of involved and have shown that sort of consistency over time. I think that's the thing that I want to see so that we don't end up with.
But like that's all code ever, right? I mean, like, I don't understand how that's any different.
Look, if somebody, if the folks that are part of a SIG have shown over time that they're committed to that SIG, and they say, hey, we think this is actually in scope and something that's part of the SCID, that's part of the SIG, then I think there's a level of acceptance there. What we don't want, and I think as we go through and we do the sub-project assignment exercise that we did as we're getting more formal, we have situations where you have SIGs that now own code and they're like, what the hell? Like, we don't have any experts on this. We don't have the time for this. That's the thing that I think we need to be worried about.
But I think the flip side is we've seen numerous examples where people who owned SIGs were just straight up wrong, right? And there's no forum for that to be proven out.
Straight up wrong as in?
Like they technically, like go look at the comments that people made on the third-party resources proposal.
So I think at the end of the day, who decides what's right? We can't just throw code in the, like we have people who have leadership in our community and we defer to them for making decisions.
No, I know that, that's fine. I totally agree.
In the wrong direction.
Other people want to talk too.
Yeah, I'll shut up. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I don't want to disturb, but Phil, go for it.
Hey, great. Thanks, Michelle. Sorry if this has already been answered in the discussion, but like, how is a working group different than just a bunch of people getting together and doing it on their own? Like, is there any special thing imbued in that or endorsement, or is it just they get a Slack channel and discoverability in sigs.yaml?
I think that's about it. I mean, I think in some ways it's also just a way for people to come together in a group that without having to, like, it's hard for companies to contribute to projects if they're random, basically. And so if you can get approvals to contribute to Kubernetes, then it's easier than contributing to the project.
Yeah, someone else had their hand up. I've lost track of who.
Hold on. I'm going to pause this for a second. There's like a whole thing in chat about the hand raise feature on Zoom. So like, do we want to do that? Or like, let's talk about that actually at the end and just use your physical hand unless you're not on video and then just at me and I will figure it out. Is that okay? Okay. Aaron, go for it.
I was just going to say, to me, it seems as though working group is supposed to formalize some level of structure that makes it easy for groups of people to meet on a recurring basis with an agenda at a known time with a Slack channel with a label that they can apply within the Kubernetes project or orgs. And it also has the Kubernetes project part in front of it. There are, for example, working groups within the CNCF, like the conformance working group, that tangentially discuss things around an area of interest with Kubernetes, but are not themselves part of the Kubernetes project. I guess I'm trying to figure out like what boogeymen are scaring us in this case versus where we feel like we can't necessarily just iterate.
Brian next, and then Brandan.
Oh, Clayton, did you have your hand up? You clicked the button.
I did, but you can go first.
Oh, I just want to be clear about distinguishing working groups versus repos and subprojects, because we keep mixing those things up. Like if people want to have discussion groups and they want a place to get that in the calendar so that people know there's a discussion group, we have lots of mechanisms for that. You can get a Slack channel, you can have meetings, it can be a subpart of some SIG like the cluster API or whatever. It doesn't have to be a working group. It can just be a meeting. If we want to define that working groups are discussion forums, and here's how you get one and what you do, and it's very lightweight, I'm fine with that. I think it's totally orthogonal to code, which, Brandan, I think, even wrote the doc for the different kinds of repos, and I don't see a reason to revisit that necessarily.
I was going to say I feel like working groups with SIG participation is usually the default state. Like it's very few working groups that we have that are completely disconnected from a SIG. And usually the working groups are formed in the context of a SIG. And if the bar is too high to create them, then we run into control problems. Like I think everybody should bias towards letting working groups get created, but have like the goals and the objectives of them. When it comes to code ownership, if the associated repos, assuming for a second that working groups start because people in a SIG are willing to do it, as long as you can find someone on one of those SIGs to say, like, hey, like the artifacts of this for the purposes of the working group will be associated under this SIG. Not really much of an issue. It is an issue when the working group disbands and the SIG's like, there has to be a way to to not create the problem of code that then comes back to the SIG. It's you create the code with an intent, and once the working group is done, we can, purge it or move it into its, no longer useful state and have that be clear.
Brandan and then Brian, unless Quinton wants to jump in, because I know you had something in chat, Quinton.
No, I'm listening intently.
Okay, Brandan.
Sure. I guess I think that if we want to make a distinction between working groups who produce code and discussion groups that produce white papers or something like that seems fine. And I think that is the distinction, and maybe that's the hang up as well, is that I'm thinking a lot about groups that try and move forward ideas and reach some degree of consensus and conclusion that probably actually doesn't deal with code except for in a very prototypey sort of phase. Whereas I think Brian is thinking a lot about literal, significant code landing inside of a SIG. I don't think that, I actually would prefer that we didn't distinguish between them, because I think we don't need a giant list of different kinds of groups, but it's okay. What I am deeply concerned about is that in a number of examples I've seen, effectively sort of petty dictators in projects act as a chilling effect on ideas and people coming in and participating in advancing ideas forward. And I don't think we want that. And so I think we want to be as welcoming to people iterating on things as we can. And the working groups seem like a very, very lightweight way to do that.
I am going to say maybe 5 more minutes on this, and then we should probably close out with some action item or follow-up. So I had Brian, then Joe, and then Quinton. Go for it, Brian.
Oh, yeah, I'm just still really struggling with the idea of calling what we're talking about working groups, because I think it's clear that we're not really talking about what had previously been known as working groups, that we're really talking about sub-projects that will have code in some repo. And we have structure around both those types of organizations. We have the repositories proposal, which outlines the 3 types of repositories. And we have sub-projects that are sub-part of SIGs, and they are free to have their own meeting times and whatnot. So if it's a question of how do you get buy-in in a SIG to create a new sub-project, and that's what we're trying to formalize as part of the charters. If we think that what has been proposed in the charters, in the charter template doesn't work, I think we should fix that. But otherwise, it seems like we're backtracking on the repositories proposal to say, look, things should really start in associated repos, and then they should get buy-in to get pulled in to Kubernetes.
Joe, and then Quinton, I may go before you.
Yeah, so I think, if people are prototyping stuff and it's not in a repo with Kubernetes anywhere in the name or whatever, right? I mean, that's fine. That's the associated repro. There's no implication that Kubernetes is owning or taking responsibility of that code, and nobody's going to make that mistake. If we see petty dictators, that's the type of thing why the steering committee exists. If we think that people are being unreasonable and the decisions are challenged, we should be the type of folks that can help to referee and mitigate and deal with those types of situations.
Thank you. Quinton?
Yeah, I think I want to pretty much say what Brandan and Joe said, but we're already in this small group, we're a little confused about what a working group is and what a sub-project is and what the responsibilities of a SIG are and do they block working groups, etc. And so we can't realistically expect SIGs to do the right thing. So what we presumably need to do is, my opinion is that there should be almost no reasons why you block a working group. If some group of people want to get together and under the auspices of Kubernetes discuss a topic which I would argue most of the time requires you to actually go and prototype some code. Otherwise, the discussions are kind of vacuous. They should be allowed to do that, and there should be a very limited number of reasons why that should be disallowed. And assuming that's the case, then a next phase would be like, what happens to that prototype code? How does it get into a part of actual Kubernetes? And that, I think, is the responsibility of SIGs. And if you can't get SIGs to agree to incorporate your code into their pieces of Kubernetes, then you're stuck. And then you go and fork Kubernetes or do whatever you want to do to, get that stuff to work.
I'm gonna swoop in here, and then Brandan. It's like now, yeah, we're talking about different things now, like working groups and then discussion groups, and there might be some other thing that owns or doesn't own code. I think it'd be really helpful for, I agree with Brandan and Clayton. I think it'd be really great, though, to see kind of a proposal about what your perspective on a working group and a discussion group would be, just to compare what the differences are with what we have right now, because I don't see a lot of differences in what we're talking about. There's like a few lines here and there. Okay, so Brandan, you're next, and then Phil after that. Did I miss anyone? I don't think so. Let me know in chat if I did. Brandan, then Phil. Brandan, you're muted.
Sorry. So I would concretely say I agree with Michelle, and if we just simply struck those two lines that I commented on from the PR, then I'm totally okay to merge it, right? Like, I think that it's about ensuring that we don't block people, as I think Quinton said, that it should be extremely lightweight. And I've recently been through the experience where I tried to create a working group and I was blocked, right? And that probably colors my experience.
And to be clear, you also opposed other working groups, right? So I think there's just disagreement about...
which working group did I oppose? I can't remember. I think I opposed a SIG.
A SIG and a working group.
I don't remember the working group, but I'm happy to take a look. But I think that I don't think I disagreed with the working group, but I could be wrong. But I think it's important that we allow these things to happen in a very, very lightweight manner. And I think we should separate landing code from discussion and prototyping.
So where do we, just a clarifying question, where do you think the code should land?
Oh, I think ultimately the code goes through the normal code process, right? Which is into the SIGs and all that sort of stuff. But I think that the formalism of saying, hey, we're going to all go work on this, mostly for discoverability and also sort of to prevent premature fragmentation, is valuable, right? So like, I think it's redundant and destructive to have, not necessarily destructive, but it's redundant to have 20 different people go off and sort of build roughly the same thing. And so having an identified working group says, here's the place. If you're interested in this topic and you want to go work on it with people who are interested in this topic, here's how you can find it and go do it. Even if it's mostly prototype work, right? It's more about defragmentation than anything else, and discovery.
Phil, and then we're gonna wrap up if that's okay. So Phil, and then if anybody has any ideas for how to wrap up, action items, follow up, that kind of thing. Go.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I just want to make sure that like we're actually trying to solve a specific problem here instead of like starting with working groups and then trying to decide what they are. If the community is just looking for like a place to discuss ideas, then let's just make sure it's solving like that problem and forget about all the rest of it.
I feel like you just threw out a radical idea. Okay. Oh, and I had a comment. Oh, my only issue with that PR is that it kind of convolutes like what is a working group and the governance of a working group. And I know we want to make it lightweight, and that's fine. We can have lightweight processes, but I think those two should be separate. But if we merged what Joe has in his PR, then that would be enough. So I just want to throw that as a point. I'm not going to like block that PR on separating, and maybe that's something we should consider as a follow-up item. Okay, okay, wrapping up, do we have action items and stuff that we want to write down in the doc?
I can work to get my PR in. That's at least a starting point, it sounds like.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would help clarify the distinction between the different kinds of groups and working groups and SIGs and sub-projects. And I'll have to take another look to see if it refers to the repo policy. But that seems to be...
Yeah, I'll take another pass and I'll send email to this group and we'll do a, we'll try at least get stuff in give people a chance to comment, but not bike shed. I don't know, that's optimistic.
And Brandan, you just want me to remove the one line and then send the PTAL? Is that the action item for the PR?
I mean, yeah, I think that if we struck the SIG approval line and the vendor narrowing line, or clarified the vendor narrowing line, because I feel like that's another, it just is vague. It's an opportunity for abuse. I'm okay with that.
I'll delete both of those. Does anyone have any other blocker items for it?
I thought the wording was a little confusing. I may want to give some suggestions on, especially the context part, like the first part where it says motivation. So I can get that to you today or tomorrow.
Yeah, and I guess the only other meta point that I had for the PR is there were places where I felt like there were words used, like Quinton said, endorsed, where the adjudication of who would decide if it was endorsed was unclear. Right? So maybe just something that says how those things are, either is more precise or says how those things are decided.
That's in the doc. Would you mind just commenting and making that suggestion on the doc?
Sure, I can do that.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a high-level goal for working groups is that they're primarily just a forum for collaboration, to unblock collaboration and make work discoverable, right? So we should try to focus on that and make it clear about what other policies come into play if they want to land code, just to clarify.
I can refocus the document based on that if you like, because based on this discussion, maybe some of the other parts don't make as much sense.
I apologize for jumping the queue, Michelle, but I have a question that's tangentially related to this, so I want to see if it sounds like we can answer the question or if I should just not ask this for another month until we land.
Go for it.
Okay, so there's an ongoing effort to move the Kubernetes infrastructure over to the CNCF. We have a Slack channel, we have a GitHub team, we're calling ourselves the Kate's Infra team. We decided to just go ahead and move forward with Brandan and I as steering committee representatives who would take this to the steering committee to formalize what is this thing? Do we call it a sub-project? Do we call it a working group? Do we call it a brand new SIG? Do we consider it to be a team akin to the product security team? So I had proposed the idea of it being a working group because it involves collaboration across multiple SIGs, such as release and testing and contributor experience. The difficulty is that there does need to be code written and landed as part of this. So there was concern that federating this code into sub-projects owned by those individual SIGs was seen as too confusing. I believe Brendan's counter proposal was, what if we made it like a sub-project, just like a team?
I think actually it was a team. I think it made me realize that we have another concept.
So you were using the release team as a concept when you illustrated this example because it's a group of people from across the project, but that's actually something SIG Release wants to charter as a sub-project because it's about developing the ongoing release. So presumably, there's also the question of whether or not this makes sense as a Kubernetes thing at all. Maybe it should be a CNCF working group since this is about moving infrastructure over to the CNCF, but it does involve pretty much nothing but Kubernetes contributors. I'm also fine with us just rolling forward until we figure this process out. I think the important thing is A, that the steering committee is aware that this exists, and B, that we don't want to run like cowboy for too long. We do want some level of formalism around this. So I had hoped to get more clarity on working group and the path to code ownership. I don't feel like I have that.
I mean, ultimately, who's going to be responsible for this code once it lands? Presumably the release team and SIG testing. And
yeah, it's kind of spread amongst a bunch of people. And that's why you could argue it should be something like the product security team, because there's going to need to be some level of additional vetting to make sure the right people have the right responsibilities.
But
And I think there's some new code, like we're going to land YAML files that have our DNS entries, and like that could be part of SIG release, but like it's not. There's not a clear home for that. But
so, what if or could I call it a working group for now, just so we can put it into the community, get some discoverability, and say find homes for the code in individual SIGs?
And that sounds right to me. It sounds similar to the cloud provider extraction, which currently, spans multiple SIGs.
Okay.
Ultimately, we'll need to restructure the SIGs.
That was the other model I was thinking, is that was something that started as a working group that then got promoted into a SIG when it was clear it did have to own code. So I will take an action item to move forward with proposing a new working group, and I will work with Phil to make sure that I fit whatever definition and process he is putting together. Okay, thank you for letting me jump the queue.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I think we got a lot done, y'all. Okay, so the only announcement I have is that we're having a Code of Conduct Committee knowledge transfer session on Monday, October 1st from 12:30 to 1:30. I only invited the steering committee members that have been active in helping the COCC form and get started. But if you're someone on the steering committee that didn't get an invite already, please let me know, and I'd be happy to have you join in on the call. And we're just gonna share what we know and also like answer questions and just have an informal discussion. Joe, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to participate if you think it would be valuable. I just don't have a sense in terms of what those folks are looking for, what value we can bring. So
yeah, honestly,
I don't want to butt my head in where it's not going to add value either.
Yeah, no, I don't know either. I think the more the merrier for this particular thing. I think we're just going to have to figure it out as we go. I have no idea what a code.
Right, if you could add me, that'd be great. I don't know what my calendar looks like, but yeah.
I feel like Sarah would be critical, and anybody who was on the Bootstrap committee while y'all had to deal with your code of conduct violations prior to the steering committee having to deal would be helpful.
That is, those are both really good points. I've reached out to Sarah, haven't gotten a response back, but yeah, absolutely would reschedule if she wasn't able to make it. And I'll just invite everybody on the Bootstrap committee as well. I'll just invite everybody. It's fine. I'll invite everybody. Okay, and that's all I have. That's all we have time for. We have 2 more minutes though, so does anybody have something that they want to discuss before we end? Before we adjourn? No? Okay, cool. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening, Michelle. Happy Wednesday, everybody.
Sure.
Thanks.